So one of the ways then that technology can provide value is by making things go faster. Now at this point it is easy to be dismissive about what historically constituted technological innovation, and indeed trivialise the importance of needing to speed things up. But as an illustrative example, consider stock market trading based on the latest available information. Now at the time of, say, the Battle of Trafalgar, that might have included information transmitted via carrier pigeon. So more recent examples, though still dated, might include, say, the telegraph or the railroad. Now contemporary examples might include optical fibre wires, radio waves, and the physical location of computer servers on the stock exchange. And the idea is that if this is as close as possible to the exchange, then you get a time edge in trading. So this is still a important problem from way back, even if it was originally solved using the seemingly humble carrier pigeon. When it's solved involving detailed discussions on the physical location of computer servers on stock exchanges, it's clear it's a serious and important problem. Okay, and that importance shouldn't be diminished even if it was solved in a humble way historically. So another key way in which technology can provide value is by making things cheaper. So it may be a bit vulgar to think about things in this way, but there's essentially two basic ways of making money. So infrequent transactions, large margin, or frequent transactions, small margin. Okay, and this is something I'm going to try and explore in more detail with a quantitative conceptual model later in the lecture. So the thing to bear in mind here is that you should think of new technology as essentially a democratizing process. Okay, so what you're trying to do within this is make the potential market as large as possible. So historically, technological innovation has sought to reduce costs, therefore expand the potential customer base to something that's as large as possible. So historical examples of this might include cars, flights, televisions, video recorders, mobile phones, smartphones, computers, etc. So note that these all started off as luxuries and then became seen as relatively staple items. Okay, so the whole point here is to fundamentally try and expand the potential customer base to something that's as large as possible, and you need to have in mind, I think, what you're ultimately trying to achieve with the technology. So another key way in which technology can provide value is by making things more secure. So classic examples would be more secure forms of payment. So I suspect what happens throughout history is that new technology comes in and new whizzier methods of payment are established. So things like checks, credit cards, and online payment. So you've got new ways of paying, but I suspect that what happens is that security is an afterthought and usually takes some time to catch up. So as discussed in the last lecture, increased security has been one of the key motivations behind the development of blockchain technologies, and it's natural to consider using blockchain solution as part of modern payment systems. However, again, taking your guidance from history, it's important to note that historically new payment systems have proved vulnerable to hacking in previously unanticipated ways. So new technology is great and it is important, and that's true for blockchain amongst other things, but it's unlikely to be perfect. Okay, again, there are important historical precedents here which would indicate that whilst the technology can demonstrably provide value, it's unlikely to be perfect, may have some serious flaws associated with it. Alongside the discussion of the value that new technology can provide, it's useful, I think, to talk about the implications of more automation. Okay, so when it comes to discussing automation associated with new technologies, a historical perspective is again key. So since the 18th and 19th centuries and the Luddites, economic revolutions have led to the wholesale redundancies and displacement of labour. Okay, and you could argue you're seeing a little bit of that now in a very, very accelerated timescale during the current coronavirus pandemic. So in relatively recent decades in developed economies such as the UK, this has led to the wholesale replacement of traditional manufacturing and labouring jobs with new service sectors. So as part of this, I've seen dramatic changes in my lifetime. So I was born and brought up in a coal mining area, for example. This had radically changed by the time I finished primary school. The natural question to ask is, will these trends continue, and will future innovation likely make highly skilled jobs redundant in the future? So perhaps this is inevitable, and perhaps also not always a bad thing, but if new technologies end up making people redundant, this could still constitute a significant social cost. So again, I wanted to emphasise here the importance of history with a little bit of an aside about the Luddites. So the Luddites were an organisation of English textile workers in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the Luddites destroyed textile machinery in protest against manufacturers using new forms of mechanisation, the 18th and 19th century versions of robots. There was a long-standing fear among Luddites that time spent honing the skills of their craft would be wasted, as their jobs would be replaced by machines. Note, this is a very human concern, and there's a certain amount of pride and skill. These people aren't just cavemen. Now, this term Luddite is now often used derogatively against those who oppose new technologies, but note that Luddites did place value upon the skills of their own craft. So this is a module on new financial technologies. However, it's important to realise that in an era before the welfare state, this must have felt like a battle of survival for many Luddites. Okay, and the movement culminated in a rebellion lasting from 1811 to 1816. So I just wanted to emphasise here that there may be a social cost associated with new technologies if this does lead to wholesale redundancies. Note, the Luddites, the real people with a professional sense of pride. So this fear of growing automation has been called the rise of the robots, and the reference is there to Ford 2016. So again, from a relatively recent historical perspective, increased automation has led to mass redundancies in the following sectors. So car assembly work in the 1960s to 1970s, printers in the 1970s, human computers in the 1950s, and financial traders in 2000 to the 2010s. So there's potential for wholesale reduction in employment opportunities for various skilled workers, so potentially amongst law, accounting, finance, and perhaps even higher education. Note, you're arguably seeing the beginnings of this with the mass redundancies of financial traders over the last decade or so. Okay, so it's important to emphasise here that these are skilled workers with a significant education and professional knowledge base. Okay, so perhaps this is inevitable and perhaps also not always a bad thing, but again, I just wanted to emphasise here that if new technologies end up making people redundant, this could still constitute a significant social cost, even if these things are tangibly providing monetary value. Okay, so in summary then, there's various ways in which technology can provide value. Essentially, this boils down to a basic shopping list with 4 items on it. So you can look to make things faster, you can look to make things cheaper and therefore available to more people. So again, try and think of new technology as a democratizing process. And what you're really ultimately trying to do is try and make the size of the potential customer base as large as possible. Another way in which new technology can provide value would be to make things more secure. So I suspect that how new payment systems operate is that security is often an afterthought. Another way in which technology can provide value is more automation. So Although it can provide value, I think it's important to emphasize that technology is not a panacea. It won't solve everything. New technology like blockchain may have their own limitations and may not be able to accomplish all these 4 items on this shopping list. The adoption of new technologies can also come with significant human cost attached if it's associated with wholesale redundancies. Some further concerns are discussed at length in section 4 of this lecture. So I now wanted to go on to a conceptual model for value generation, and this is a more mathematical, more quantitative way of operating, precisely because certain economic and financial problems you need numbers and math to get a deep enough understanding of what's really going on. So historically, technology has provided value by reducing the cost of products and services and by expanding the size of the market of potential customers. So what we're going to do with this conceptual model is that this is going to provide a rationalization for a technology inspired business model centered around having a low margin and a large volume of transactions. So there's a certain sense in which if you position the thing to have a low margin and a large volume of transactions, that's less risky than the alternative, which would be having a high margin and a low volume of transactions. So the idea here is that even a simple model can say something useful about some of the underlying financial and economic processes involved with value creation. And again, what we're going to see here is that there's certain economic and financial processes where you can only understand the thing in enough depth if you use numbers and math. Okay, but in this case, the model used will, I promise you, be very simple. So before I introduce this conceptual model, I wanted to talk about a probability model called the Poisson distribution, which, by way of mathematical background, is the easiest possible model for a set of count data. So the idea here is to use the Poisson distribution to model the number of sales of a product. And what's going to happen in this case is that the Poisson distribution is described by a parameter lambda, which is equal to both the mean and the variance. Now this parameter lambda is constrained to be positive, but it doesn't have to be an integer, even though this is going to relate to a counting process. So for realistic and large values of lambda, the number of sales will resemble a classical bell-shaped curve, which is something you will have likely seen before as part of high school math. Now this is as a consequence of what's called the central limit theorem. The textbook reference there is to a good probability book by Grimmett and Sturzaker. So this states that if you have a large sample under certain regular conditions, the probability calculations that you need to do will just involve the mean and the variance. Now this becomes even easier for the Poisson distribution because in this case the mean and the variance are equal to each other. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of how to use this Poisson distribution. So the parameter lambda that we mentioned in the previous slide, it has to be positive, but it doesn't have to be a whole number. So for the first example, suppose that x has a Poisson distribution with mean lambda equals 45.4. You're asked to calculate the probability that x equals 42. Well, the calculation in question would just be exactly as it says there on the slide. Now if you can do this by hand, you must be a Vulcan, but if you do this using a calculator, you should be able to get the value there, 0.05391357. So I'm aware that some of my past students have had problems finding the factorial button and the exponential button on their calculator, so if you have problems, do let me know and we can sort that out. And the second example there, you're asked to calculate the probability that x equals 67 if the parameter lambda is equal to 69.5. Again, I've given you a detailed example there on the slide, and if you use a calculator you should be able to get the answer 0.04651215 in this case. Okay, so it is just practice, and I will not aim to kill you all in the coursework by setting questions that are too computationally demanding.